So here we are in the middle of 7.5 acres of wild woodland near the North Norfolk coast. Welcome to Dreamy Hollow World War I Trenches. They were built in World War I by an elite group called the Lovat Scouts. They came down to this part of Norfolk during the summer of 1915 and built a 15.5 acre mock battlefield. Half of it mock German trenches on the high ground, half of it British trenches on the low ground. But they were special trenches. Instead of being bog standard Kitchener's men trenches, these were dug to different designs. The Lovat Scouts were researching and developing trench warfare. You've probably never heard of the Lovat Scouts, but they went on to form the basis of the British Army Commandos and the Special Air Service. Lord Lovat's nephew was David Stirling. Lord Lovat's son, Shimmy Lovat, led the assault on Sword Beach on D-Day. When we discovered these trenches in 2012, nobody knew who'd dug them. Years of research later by my friends, the late John Smith and the late Tony Armstrong, uncovered that there were 500 men here with their retinue. And they also uncovered 41 local newspaper articles about their stay during the summer of 1915. During the August, they left on the SS Adania for Suvla Bay. It could have been that they were going into the oblivion of Gallipoli, but for one man, Second Lieutenant Joe Pease, who saw what a poison chalice the mission on Suvla Bay was. The Lovat Scouts were charged with evacuating our chaps out of Suvla Bay, and he saw it was going to be a bloodbath. So, being free thinkers, many of them were gamekeepers, he came up with the idea of a candle that burns down, lights a fuse and fires a bullet. That night, the Turks thought we were sniping at them. The Lovat Scouts lead our chaps out of the trenches, down the cliffs into the boats. And there were only 6 casualties, the last Lovat Scouts on the beach. At that point, the British Army turned round and wondered who these chaps were. From there they went to Egypt and served with the household cavalry, the line and the Camel Corps. And after that, they went to the Western Front. But by 1918, word had got out. They were so highly regarded, especially by Churchill, who was the First Lord of the Admiralty, that a Lovat Scout was seconded to every unit on the Western Front as experts. When World War II came, the War Department already knew about these guys. They sent them to Canada to learn how to ski down a mountain and fire a rifle at the same time. And then they were involved in early commando raids on Scandinavia, going into the Lofton Islands and stealing the radar equipment and the code book and blowing the place up on the way out. By the end of World War II, Shimmy Lovat was leading the assault on Sword Beach and David Stirling was leading the SAS. So now let's take you through the trenches that they built in that summer of 1915. Welcome to the start of our World War I trench tour at Dreamy Hollow. But before we go into the trenches, let me show you a very important photograph. This is what started it all off. A photograph taken by the Royal Air Force in July 1947, kept in the archives at Norfolk Archaeological Department. It turned up when we were doing a search of the land, and it proved that this wasn't just woodland. So what can we see? We can see the trenches as they exist today, but this section has been cleared out for the trench walk. The rest has been left wild for future generations. We can see the quarrying that took place during the Cold War. Quarrying for RAF Sculthorpe, for the nuclear bombers, and quarrying for the top secret listening station on RAF Bircham next door. We can see the boundary with the former RAF station and the change in boundary during World War II. Now this is all that's left, 3.5 acres, but there was 15.5 acres of mock battlefield. There would have been 7.5 acres of battlefield to the north, dug to a German design on the high ground, and there would have been 7.5 acres of trenches to the south, with another front line here and another on the neighbouring land. If you look carefully, you can see that the trenches are all different shapes, left-handed, right-handed, different shapes here. That's because these weren't just training trenches. These were research and development training trenches. And the Lovat Scouts went the whole way. After they'd finished digging the German trenches, they would put people in there playing Germans. And the guys digging the British trenches 100 yards away would have to dig those trenches silently at night without the Germans hearing them. And once they'd dug the zigzags, they'd dig the supply trenches, and only then may they reveal themselves to the foreign forces. The ground here is sand and gravel and flint, so they would have used wooden shovels and antimony alloy shovels to dig the trenches silently. Each soldier was required to dig 6 foot a day. We think that they did it within 2 weeks because there were 500 soldiers here. This is why the trenches being dug by the Lovat Scouts, who then became commandos in the SAS, and these trenches being technically inverse defence position research and development trenches, this is why Historic England have listed them as a site of national importance. Apart from any that may exist in Gallipoli, these are the only Lovat Scout trenches known to be in existence. Now let me take you through a trench tour. We have a history and prayer walk through the trenches here with a storyboard that tells the history of a particular year in the war and a storyboard that gives a flavour of the year. When we cleared out the trenches, we didn't go down to the archaeology. Working with the archaeologists, we agreed that we'd only take out a channel through the infill. So these trenches would be deeper and wider than you see here, and that's simply to protect the archaeology for the future. However, in that process we did find bullets in the walls of the trenches, an indication that the Lovat Scouts trained under live fire as elite forces do today. They were mainly officers' revolver bullets, so we think that the officers stood on the top of the trenches and took pot shots as the chaps went through. So as we walk down, we're walking down one of the supply trenches, and you will see in this section where part of the infill has fallen off, and this is what they were digging through: sand and gravel and flint. And imagine doing that in the middle of the night, trying not to make a noise. But in reality, on the Western Front, if they made a noise, the Germans would find their position and shell them. So we carry on walking down. This is a course through the 1 acre of trench that we've cleared. And as you can probably see from the undergrowth, it's a full-time job keeping it clear. Nature would recover this within 2 or 3 years if we left it alone. As we come up to a junction here, this is the 1914 meditation board, and we've chosen the soldier. If I should die, think only this of me, that there's some corner of a foreign field that is forever England. And that was very much the feeling in 1914. That these young lads, they were going to go and be heroes. The war was going to be over by Christmas. They were going to come back to their town or village, and all the girls would be wanting to marry them, and they'd have their medals. Behind that poem is the reality. They were going to a hell on earth, a war that bear absolutely no resemblance to wars that had gone before. Shortly after writing this poem, Rupert Brooke lost his life. And at this point we can see what we found in 2012. These were the strange depressions in the ground covered by brambles that sparked our curiosity. They were mistaken as drainage ditches. It was only when we did a search of the land that our friends, the archaeologists at Gressing Hall, turned up that aerial photograph and revealed that these weren't simply drainage ditches, these were WW1 trenches. And thank you to Dr. Simon Hoggett for first identifying that on the aerial photograph. This piece of trench, we tried not to take all the infill out, but down this length of trench we accidentally got down to the base layer, and we noticed a green line in the sand and we couldn't work out why this trench had got a mouldy green line down the middle of it, until we realised that that was the rut worn by the soldiers in 1915. It had filled with water. The water had gone green and stained the sand. So we covered it up, told the archaeologists, and that's there one day for somebody to rediscover, but they left their footprints here. Carry on to examples of the World War I pickets that we found, and if you want to know why the archaeologists told us these were World War I pickets and not World War II, because there is a World War II history to this site as well, and a Cold War history. You can see where the blacksmith has put his thumb when he's bent the metal around the former. You won't see that on World War II pickets. Moving round, we discovered the most dangerous place in the trenches. This is a reconstructed area. This T-shaped trench was a latrine trench. The chances are that rather going back a hero, if the Germans found out where the latrine trench was, you'd be shelled while you were sitting over the bucket. It was very important to keep the location of the latrine trenches from the Germans. And then we walk up to a choke point. There are several choke points in the trench design, which mean that if the Germans were to get over into the trenches, you could set up a machine gun position here and stop them from both sides, or you may set up a machine gun position here, keep resupplying your chaps down the other side, and the Germans would just come round the corner into a machine gun position. But we'll walk now to the front of the trenches. We have a board here that tells about the reality of the gas attack, because by 1915 gas was being used. Gas was heavier than air. It had an effect on the skin and on the lungs, and the first thing that you would know that gas was coming is when you'd see a yellow-green cloud coming across no man's land in front of you. People would be ringing bells, blowing whistles, going down into bunkers. In the early days there were no gas masks. The only way to protect yourself was to take your hanky out your pocket and dip it into a bucket of urine that was kept at the front line and cover your face with a urine-soaked rag. A little later they invented gas hoods, and then they invented the gas mask. But this was a horrible stage of the war. Gas was designed to disable many troops and divert able-bodied troops from the fight to look after them. Particularly nasty weapon. We go forward to an area of reconstructed World War I trench. We've tried to make this as authentic as possible. We know from photographs that the Lovat Scouts didn't use wiggly tin or concrete. They used wood. Unfortunately, at Dreamy Hollow we have 86 species of fungi, very diverse, but it also means that wood lasts on average 3 years. So the maintenance job for keeping these trenches authentic is quite a big one. In front of you, you'll see all the World War I pickets that we found. The barbed wire is mocked because health and safety won't allow us to use real barbed wire. Although there are some bits of original barbed wire on the old pickets, which is just as crumbly as biscuits now. It's really old. Ahead of you is no man's land, and the German front line would have been about 100 yards away from here. As we walk through this trench, you'll see that it's like a fire bay. When they dug these trenches, originally they digged a trench 5 yards long and stop for 2 yards. 5 yards long, stop for 2 yards. And then they'd fill that dotted line of trenches in with soldiers just to protect them. Only then would they dig back and dig a zigzag, and then they dig the supply trenches. The reason for this is quite simple. First of all, if a shell lands in a straight trench, the blast will go straight down it. If you put a zigzag in, chaps will be protected from it. It's also more difficult to invade. If the Germans get over the top of a particular piece of trench, they have to fight their way around corners. So it fulfills two purposes. This particular design of 5 yards, stop for 2 yards, 5 yards, stop for 2 yards, appeared in a letter from Second Lieutenant Joe Pease of the Lovat Scouts. Joe, we believe, from his research in his letters, was the chap who supervised the digging of the trenches here. He was also a mine manager before the war, which adds weight to the theory of the historic England archaeologists that there may also be tunnels under here, that maybe the German positions were undermined, and it was not just digging of trenches at Dreamy Hollow, it was digging tunnels under the enemy lines. Joe's a very interesting character because he's responsible for getting the Lovat Scouts noted at the evacuation of Suvla Bay, which I'll go into detail a little bit later. So first of all, through the trenches. So now we're going down the line of zigzags. The zigzag front line goes the whole length of the site. But we'll take a bit of a diversion off down the supply trench. We have an observation platform here, and here we have our World War I bunker. So this is Sergeant Taylor's World War I bunker. Sergeant Taylor, because we have a tradition at Dreamy Hollow that people who help us have things named after them. Sergeant Taylor is Mark Taylor of Time Trippers, the reenactors, who's given us a lot of help in developing the site. He helped us clear out this original hole. There was a large depression here full of rubbish, which we believe was an officer's bunker. But in reconstructing a bunker, we had to bear in mind that if we wanted to allow people to stay in it, it needed to be weatherproof and it needed to be up to reasonable modern standards. I don't think the camping industry would have gone for a bush shelter design with no doors and mud on the floor and probably large rodents running around. That would have been too authentic. So we've gone for a design which takes artistic license. So in this bunker, it's built to the dimensions of a World War I bunker, 8 by 12, but it's only got 4 bunks, not 14 bunks, as would have been in the day. It has doors on it, and in order to put the doors on, we've moved the bunker 3 foot forward into the supply trench. It would have been that in the day that the front of the bunker would have been here between the 2 doors, and you'd had a curtain hanging here, and there'd have been soldiers running by you, and the other side of the curtain you'd have been asleep in your bunk. To make it usable for winter, we have a small wood burner, which they probably wouldn't have had. We have one or two bits and pieces like hurricane lamps and a table and chairs, but essentially it's a camping bothy. If you come to stay in our bunker, it's not a glamping pod, it's a camping bothy. But it's a camping bothy that gives a nod to World War I history and gives you a flavour of what it's like to stay in a World War I bunker. So now we'll head out of the bunker. So we realised that letting the bunker, our campsite loos are some distance away and we didn't want to get smelly, so we've used the officers' latrine trench, T-shaped latrine trench, to put in what would have been to them a very modern latrine, which is a conventional camping loo on a wooden floor with a piece of Hessian curtains for privacy. Bearing in mind that in World War I there are pictures of soldiers on 20-foot planks hanging their backsides over the ground. Privacy wasn't an issue in those days, but we have to cater for that in the modern world. So let's carry on down the trenches. Again, we're heading off down a supply trench, but when we get to this corner you'll see that it's not a straight T. It's a very good reason. If the Germans were chasing me down this trench, I could come round and give some covering fire to my friends and kill the Germans. If the Germans landed a shell down there, the blast wouldn't come all the way down into this trench. It would be diverted by the swept T. Now we carry on down some more supply trench. Here we come to a board that reminds us how history turned on a knife point. When Tsar Nicholas abdicated, there was a period where it looked like the Germans were going to win the war, and all the history that would have come out of that. But on April the 6th, the United States declared war on Germany, and the tide started to turn. But many of the heroes in World War I became anti-war, particularly the great poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon. So we remember another battle that was going on between those who were pro-war and those who were pacifists. And this board gives an idea of the horror that they came from. The idea that a man could sink in no man's land up to his waist and be crying out for several days to be rescued, or men would slip off the duckboards into the mud and never be seen again. This particular section of the trench we haven't got to the bottom of yet. When asked how deep were the trenches, well, they varied from 4 or 5 feet for the Bantam battalions to 12 to 14 feet for soft ground conditions and maybe the Royal Artillery. We believe that these trenches are much deeper here. We've only got down to the 1970s level, but it would mean a major archaeological dig to get to the bottom of this section of front line with health and safety concerns and all the rest of it. As we come out of our trench tour, we always end up with an act of memorial, an act of remembrance. So on this board where we describe the Battle of Passchendaele, war on an industrial scale, war where 9.5 million people were unaccounted for, they were never found. We usually read the 23rd Psalm to those going through the trenches, and we walk in silence to the memorial board. It's here that we talk about how the war ended, but we also talk about those for whom the war never ended. Those with what we would call PTSD today, it was called shell shock in those days. Those who had injuries that they lived with for the rest of their lives. And we take a moment to pause and reflect. If people are secular and they just want to leave their thoughts on the board, we have square magnetic post-its. If people have a faith and they want to leave their prayers on the board, they can use the crosses. We've had school trips here where it's been a busy day looking after a coach load of school children, and you come back the next day to clear up. And one of the most moving things is to read the prayers of the children. So here we come to our permanent memorial to the 500 Lovat Scouts who were here in the summer of 1915. You can see from the sculptures that they're in different uniforms. In the front we have the uniform of the mounted brigade, because they were mounted yeomanry on their Highland ponies. The smaller cap and the riding breeches. Behind we see them as infantry with the larger Highland bonnet and the kilts, which they would have worn covers over the top of. If they got their kilts wet, the chafing would make their legs sore. We also see that they're carrying Lee Enfield rifles. Well, Lovat Scouts, being more of a free spirit than most World War I soldiers, actually didn't always use the Lee Enfield as they were trained. They had a reputation for firing from the hip, literally, and some of them preferred the American carbine lever action and would go into battle with the butt on the hip, pulling the lever. It's little wonder that later they became commandos and SAS. We turn now to a memorial that's different because this is a work in progress. We don't know who the 500 were here. We have about 10% of the names. The reason for that is in 1918, when Churchill commanded that every unit on the Western Front should have a Lovat Scout attached to them, it's very difficult to find the Lovat Scouts. In this memorial telescope, a telescope, why a telescope? Because they used telescopes in the Boer War. When they were originally formed in the Boer War, going behind enemy lines, collecting intelligence, they were non-combatants. They used their telescopes to bring intelligence to the British Army. So here we have the telescope, and inside we have the memorial book. This shows the Lovat Scouts going through Hunstanton, and then this is the work in progress. For some people, we know where they came from in Scotland, we know who their mum and dad was, we know when they were killed, and we know where their grave is. For others, we simply know their rank and their name. There are examples of people who went through the transition. This is how they would have been when they arrived at Dreamy Hollow. They would have to surrender their Highland ponies, and then they became infantrymen. And then there's this guy, Warrant Officer Moles, was seconded to the Seaforth Highlanders. So he would have been listed as Warrant Officer Moles, Seaforth Highlanders, open bracket, second Lovat Scout, close brackets. That's why it's not easy to find them. This book was the work of our friend and researcher, Tony Armstrong. Tony has unfortunately passed away, and we need to carry on the work. But it's all kept under the Lovat Scout badge, which is a stag's head, and their motto, I am ready. And now I said I would talk to you about a key character in the history of the Lovat Scouts. When John, Tony and myself were researching the Lovat Scouts, we got to like this guy. And I'd encourage you to read up on his history. He's Second Lieutenant Joe Pease. Joe came from a Quaker family. His dad was Lord Pease, and that explains why we have access to Joe's uncensored letters. We believe that the reason why Joe was able to send such explicit letters through the post was his dad was a lord, and we think that the army censors didn't want to cross swords with the lord. So we find in his letters things that you should never find in the soldiers' letters home. And bear in mind that during World War I, soldiers weren't even supposed to take their box brownie into battle. Photographs were forbidden. Definitely shouldn't be writing home about training courses. But thanks to Joe, we have a letter home that details a training course he went on, how to dig trenches. And when we read this letter and we compare the dimensions and the design with what we have at Dreamy Hollow, they match exactly. Joe was taught to dig for 5 yards and stop for 2 yards. That's what it says in the training. Joe was taught to put wine glass choke points in. That's exactly what we found. So this is good documentary evidence for the fact that the Lovat Scouts were working to a design. and Joe was here supervising it. Interestingly, Joe was a mine manager before the war. He came from a Quaker family that was into mining. One of the Norfolk archaeologists believes that we have tunnels under here, and that's one of the next stages of investigation for us. There are 3 square depressions on site. Are they filled in mine shafts? And if they're filled in mine shafts, was Joe here researching it, digging it? Then we turn to this letter home, which is really important. This is the reason the Lovat Scouts were noticed. Because they were a private territorial army, and most of us would, if some billionaire decided to form a private army and go and fight for our country in a foreign land, we'd feel suspicious. Well, Lord Kitchener was very suspicious of Lord Lovat's private army. He'd had encounters with territorials in France and didn't much trust them. That's why they were here in 1915 and not on the Western Front. Lord Kitchener was keeping them here. The young Churchill, then First Lord of the Admiralty, kept challenging Kitchener. We've got these highly trained troops in Norfolk, keen to get into battle. Why aren't you sending them into action? They were becoming a bit of a problem because high-spirited Highland lads ready for battle were doing things like throwing a conscientious objector into the duck pond at Great Massingham, getting drunk and in trouble with the ladies, and 1 or 2 of them ended up in prison cells, and it needed the army to get them out because they were needed for their country. Eventually Lord Kitchener relented, but I always wonder whether it was a slightly spiteful decision, because by then Gallipoli was a disaster. He turned to Churchill and said, okay, your Lovat Scouts can go to Gallipoli. And they were given a poison chalice. They were given the task of evacuating British Tommies from Suvla Bay. And Joe looked at this and he thought, this is going to be a disaster. The Turks are on the high ground. The moment we get out of the trenches, we're going to be cut to pieces. There's going to be more bloodshed in the evacuation than there was in the advance. But the Lovat Scouts, remember, were gamekeepers and gillies. They weren't British soldiers who were told they weren't paid to think. They were just told to obey orders. Joe thought about the situation, and he saw that he'd got loads of bullets and he'd got lots of candles and lots of fuse. And he came up with a little device that when the candle burns down, it lights a bullet, it lights a fuse and fires a bullet. So the night of the evacuation, these devices were set upon the trench tops. The Turks thought we were sniping at them. Trained to move silently at night, they evacuated our soldiers out of the trenches, down the cliffs into the boats. And in Joe's letter home to his mother and father, he says, as we neared the safety of the ships, I could hear my little devices still going off, and I gave a chuckle to myself. The chuckle was that in the evacuation of Suvla Bay, there were only 6 casualties. They were the last 6 Lovat Scouts to leave the beachhead, and they lost their lives. But from that point onward, seeing the disasters in the British Army, the regulars looked at this ragtag bunch of Dad's army and thought, who are these guys? From there they went to Egypt and served with the household cavalry of the line and the camel corps, but they'd already got themselves a reputation. By 1918, Churchill had decreed that every unit on the Western Front should have a Lovat Scout assigned to them. By World War II, they were selected to go to Canada to ski down mountains and fire a rifle at the same time. And then they became the Commandos and the SAS that we know. The Lovat Scouts survived various British Army reorganisations until the 1960s, when they were sort of reorganised out as a name. The name lives on in an Army Cadet Force in the Orkneys, but it lives on even more in the tradition of the British Commandos and the SAS. So that's why Joe's a very important character in the history at Dreamy Hollow. The original front line would have gone all through these trees. Unfortunately, part of it was quarried away during the Cold War. But if you come to Dreamy Hollow, you'll see how nature has reclaimed this site. Nature's reclaimed it from the quarrying and from the digging of the trenches, and the history during World War II, when we believe that the Secret Army or the auxiliary units were operational in the woods, and from the Cold War, when we believe that the American Air Force was here quarrying for work at Sculthorpe, the nuclear bomber base, and when the RAF were here quarrying for the top secret listening centre next door. But history goes back the other way, because we found musket balls, which suggests that even during the Civil War there was military practice going on here. There's an awful lot yet to find out about this site and its military history, but I hope that's just given you a flavour and sparked your interest. Well, thank you for going on a journey through Dreamy Hollow World War I trenches with us, and I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank those that are no longer with us. Much of the work done at Dreamy Hollow on the Lovat Scouts was done by my friends, the late John Smith and the late Tony Armstrong. This is Tony presenting his work to Dreamy Hollow. Hours and hours of research. We went to the area around Ypres and researched the World War I trenches. We went up to Fort George and we spent 3 days at Fort George going through soldiers' letters and photographs. It was on that trip to Fort George that we all sort of fell silent after working through a pile of letters that ends with a telegram that the soldier has been killed or missing in action. And after we'd done that, I turned to Tony and John and said, we just can't leave it like this. We've got to do something. Can't just read their letters and go home. So it was at that point that Tony continued his research into the soldiers, and John organised and Stanton Town Council, and we had a memorial concert that's still out there in YouTube somewhere, where the last commander of the Lovat Scouts, Lieutenant Colonel Grenville Johnston, came along with the Bishop of Lynn to dedicate our war memorial. Also there was the son of Bill Millin, Shimmy Lovat's World War II piper on Sword Beach. And there's an interesting talk from John Millin about his father's exploits in World War II. But probably one of the most moving moments from the day, a moment that I'll leave you with, was after we'd finished the 2-minute silence, Bill Millin's grandson, Jacob Millin, takes up the pipes and he plays Lord Lovat's Lament for the Fallen. and walked through the trenches. The first time those trenches had heard the pipes in 100 years. Later on, the whole site bloomed with Scottish thistles. Something that happened that year has never happened again. Thank you.